Hello and welcome to Bangalore International Centre's very own podcast, BIC Talks. Bangalore International Centre is a platform for informed conversations, exchange of ideas, and a space for arts and culture. BIC Talks brings the essence of all that the physical space stands for and more to your doorstep. Prativadi Bhayankaram Anna, who composed this prayer in the 15th century, was a saint, a poet, and an ardent devotee of Lord Vishnu. The poet's devotion shines through most unforgettably in MS Subbulakshmi's rendition, which rings through many South Indian homes in the mornings. You may have guessed what we were talking about by now. It's the Suprabhatam. Venkatesh Parthasarathy talks to Karthik Venkatesh about his first book around the history of one of India's most loved prayer, Suprabhatam. Welcome, Venkatesh and Karthik. Over to you.
So, Venkatesh, we are going to talk about your recent book, Venkatesa Suprabhatam, which is subtitled The Story of India's Most Popular Prayer. So, the obvious question to begin with, what attracted you to the Venkatesa Suprabhatam? Why did you decide to research into this topic and eventually to write a book on this?
Thank you, Karthik, and thank you, BIC. It's very nice being here today. So, Karthik, I was studying Sanskrit for the last so many years, and around 4-5 years ago, I decided to give my father a translation of the Venkatesa Suprabhatam as a kind of a nostalgia for his 80th birthday. So I translated the prayer. And when I translated it, I realized that there are so many aspects to it which were fascinating. So I started exploring. And the thing about such journeys is the more you read, the more you realize how little you actually know. So beyond a point, it took a life of its own, this quest. And as you know, a couple of years ago, I chanced upon you all. I mean, the advice was, why don't you formalize this in a book? And it has been a terrific 2.5 years of research and writing. I've enjoyed myself thoroughly. And I've learned a lot and found a lot of aspects of this prayer, which I believe make it so popular. And hopefully people will continue to find it popular.
Now, you call the Venkatesa Suprabhatam India's most popular prayer. How did you come by to make that judgment? What's the story behind that?
It's a good question. And there are many prayers extant in the country which have a fairly large following and a lot of recitation. But what I found out that was the Venkatesa Suprabhatam has been popular not just over the last 50, 60 years, but it has also been popular through the centuries. Of course, in the last 50, 60 years, the fusion of the genius of MS Amma and the extraordinary quality of the composer, Prativadi Bhayankaram Anna, as well as the advances in modern technology have all combined to make this probably the largest selling non-film recording. But much before that, if you look back over the centuries, we find that the Suprabhatam was quite popular. This has been a tradition of unbroken recitation since mid-15th century onwards. And as early as the 1860s, there were printed copies of this book which was available. There are many manuscript versions of this prayer. There are 45 listed even formally by the catalogorum, but I'm sure there are a lot more. So there were many manuscript versions of this poem. There was a lot of grants which were given to the morning invocation after this prayer was composed. And from the 1860s onwards, this started getting printed in the form of books. It became part of many prayer books. So this would have been popular, even though it's extremely popular in the last 60, 70 years. My estimate is that popularity has been a lot more enduring than what is immediately apparent.
Now, you speak about the prayer having been in continuous recitation since the 15th century. That's virtually 500 years. Take us a little bit back in time. Tell us a little bit about the circumstances in which this prayer was composed. who composed it, who was this individual who was chosen to compose it, and so on.
So around the middle of the 14th century, there were a lot of disturbances in the Kaveri Delta area. And many of those who used to serve temples moved to Tirumala because of its relative safety. Because due to a combination of circumstances, whether it was the exertions of the then Hoysala king or its inaccessibility, Tirumala emerged as an oasis of calm, even in the midst of Malik Gafur's incursions and the later, foundation of the Sultanate of Madurai. One of the practices which could have started at that time was the recitation of a morning prayer to Lord Ranganatha, which is called Tirupalli Ezhuchi, probably started getting recited in front of the shrine to Venkateswara at Tirumala. Early in the 15th century, the very famous religious teacher called Manavala Mamuni in the Sri Vaishnava tradition, who visited Tirumala along with many of his disciples. And one of those disciples was an extraordinary scholar and a saint called Prativadi Bhayankaram Anna. So Manavala Mamuni, and this is my estimation of this event probably happened between 1420 and 1430. Manavala Mamuni requested Anna to compose a morning prayer exclusively for Venkateswara. And because they found a lack, they thought Tirupalli Ezhuchi was for Lord Ranganatha, so they thought there should be something specifically for Lord Venkateswara. So Anna then composed the Suprabhatam for Lord Venkateswara. Now, Anna himself was an extraordinary man. He's a child prodigy, and his real name was Hastagiri Natha when he was born. But he took up cudgels on behalf of his teacher in a debate and arrested the opponent. So his teacher gave him the title of Prativadi Bhayankaram Anna, which means someone who is the terror of his opponents. But from what we know of all accounts of his life, he was a very humane. He was not a terror in that sense. He was a very empathetic and a humble individual who spent a lot of his time in doing small services for various deities and temples. And late in his life, he was instructed to compose a Suprabhatam, which he did. So his life has been one of service and scholarship, and that is something which we can all draw inspiration from. Then around the 1450s, 1460s, the morning recitations to Lord Venkateswara. And around that time, probably the Suprabhatam was also being sung, though we don't have any direct references to this. These recitations started getting a lot of grants, a lot of endowments. And then there was a sequence of some 60, 70 years where there were 3 Vijayanagar kings who were very great devotees of Lord Venkateswara and therefore patrons to the temple. This is basically Saluva Narasimha, Krishna Devaraya and Achyuta Devaraya. Except for a small interregnum in the middle, their reigns were almost simultaneously one after the other. And in their times, the Tirumala temple reached a very high point in its history. And the Venkatesa Suprabhatam would have benefited. Around that time was also, in that period also, Talapaka Annamacharya lived and composed, and he's again one of the greatest saints of the time, and probably the greatest composer of religious prayers of all time. He's said to have composed close to 32,000 prayers in praise of Lord Venkateswara. His family had the hereditary rights of reciting prayers in front of the shrine, and they were doing this. So we do find some evidences that they probably started reciting the Venkatesa Suprabhatam definitely from around the 1520s. And this recitation would have continued. Though again, evidences are very few and far in between. They would have stuck to the job because when the East India Company took over around 1804, they did write a report on the temple. And in one of those, there is a mention that the Talapaka family were still reciting the Venkatesa Suprabhatam. And that report is around 1890. So they continued. It continued much further. And as I mentioned earlier, from the 1860s onwards, this started getting printed in the book form. First in what was then Madras, and then by 1875 in Bombay also. So this has been a fairly continuous tradition all through these centuries.
Coming to the prayer itself, it is a prayer to Lord Venkateswara, etc. But tell us a little more about it. What does it say, at least in its initial verses? What is its message? What is its essence, if I might use that word, and so on. Just give us a little glimpse of all of that.
So the prayer itself begins with a verse from the Ramayana. The first verse is actually taken from the Balakanda of the Ramayana, which is the first verse, which is kausalyāsuprajā, Rama, pūrvā, saṃdhyā, pravartate. That's the first line. And that is basically said by Vishwamitra in the Ramayana. He says that to Rama and Lakshmana, who were sleeping in a bed of grasses or reed, and asks them to wake up and go about their daily routines. And there's a deeper meaning to their daily routines because he had just taken them from Ayodhya because they were supposed to go and protect hermitages from various demons. So that's how it starts. And the first verse itself is said by many to be the first Suprabhatam because it contains all the elements of a Suprabhatam, which is typically invocation to a particular favored deity, a description of nature. There is an invocation to ask the deity to do something for you, for whoever is praying. And finally, it implies a sense of surrender, that look, we are coming to you for protection. So this is supposed to be the 4 parts of a Suprabhatam, and the first verse captures this. The Venkatesh Suprabhatam echoes these themes. The Venkatesh Suprabhatam is an invocation, in some ways, an invocation of nature. And there is repeated references to many of the routines of daily life. Anna talks about cowherds in their sheds. He talks about birds in their cages. He talks about morning breeze wafting through scented groves. So everywhere the imagery is of a morning, where nature is just waking up, and everybody is uniting in terms of invoking Venkateswara. So there's a lot of celebration of nature. There is a lot of celebration of daily routine, and the underlying message is, you can find a lot to celebrate in the small things and small joys of life.
So that being the case, so it's as much an ode to nature, so to speak, as it is a prayer to God or a morning prayer to God. Would we be right in assuming that?
That's one part of it. See, because prayers like these are really up to the individual, because Anna himself was an extraordinary saint. So the composition would have been in such a fashion that the messages would have been universal. So at a simplest, you can consider this to be that. It's a question of at what level does one wish to engage with this. You can engage with this at a level which is not very deep, or you can engage it at a much deeper level and look at it as something that you wish to follow for self-realization. But really, the beauty of the prayer is that each listener can engage to it at their own level. Some can find things in nature to celebrate, others can consider paths to self-liberation. The idea of also kind of putting this in the context of the history of the recitation and the history of the composition is by looking at the lives of those who composed it. And that's where I think looking at history is very important, is looking at the lives of those who composed it and those who sustained it and continue to sustain it. One is struck by the devotion to duty and the discipline. So that's the big message that you take out, is, the devotion to small minor things, being extremely disciplined, are all ways of invoking whoever you wish to invoke. Whoever is your popular deity. So I would say those are the kind of underlying messages to prayers of this nature.
Now, moving from the early circumstances of its composition and so on, moving from there for the 15th century to the 20th century. Now, the popularity of this poem, the popularity of this prayer is largely due to the recitation done by MS Subbulakshmi, MS Amma, as you very fondly called her earlier. Circumstances in which she was called upon to recite it, what was the training given to her? Take us a little bit through all of those things.
The modern history of the Tirumala temple really begins around 1933 when the TTD took over, the Tirupati Tirumala Devasthanam. And in the early years after they took over, this would have continued to be a semi-private kind of a recitation in the mornings. Whoever reached Tirumala, and there were by that time I think quite a few who were reaching, because the railway services to Tirumala had started by 1902 and 1903. So whoever could reach early in the morning would be able to participate. But also what was happening simultaneously in the larger context was there were lots of other media which were emerging, and radio broadcasts had emerged by the 40s as a very powerful medium. And we all know that because at the dawn of independence, all the great and good across the breadth of the subcontinent used this to get their points of view across. So broadcasting as a medium was getting a lot of popularity. I don't know his name, but there must have been some extraordinarily insightful manager in HMV who would have realized that the power of the composition combined with the new medium of broadcasting must be a very irresistible combination. So what he did is he approached the TTD in the early 50s and he met the then EO, who's a gentleman, reasonably famous gentleman called C. Anna Rao, and asked him to depute somebody to recite the Suprabhatam. And Mr. Anna Rao deputed a gentleman called P.V. Ananthasayanam, who was then the lead reciter of various Vedas and various things in Tirumala. Ananthasayanam, P.V. Ananthasayanam's story itself is an extraordinary story of dedication, hard work, scholarship, and at one level, extreme detachment. And pursuing his life story was one of the joys for me also when I was researching the book. Very difficult. But he seems to have been a person who served without expectation. So anyway, he was called to recite the Suprabhatam. And he did it in the early 50s. And HMV released a box set of LPs, which is now very rare collector's item. And that was the first official recording since independence of the Suprabhatam. AIR by that time was also kind of getting into shape. I mean, all the regional radio channels had been merged. And there was a structure, and there was a information and broadcasting minister at that period called Mr. Keskar, who had a strong point of view on the educative aspects of radio broadcasting. I mean, the byproduct is, of course, he banned cricket and movie film songs, and the beneficiary being Radio Ceylon. But what he also did was he collected the best musical talent in India and invited them to come and perform on the AIR. So the AIR records, Prasar Bharati records today are one of the greatest collections and archives of classical music recording anywhere in the world. And since their stated objective was to popularize Indian culture, the Venkatesa Suprabhatam seemed to be a natural choice because by the time it was a popular. And first recording, they did ask P.V. Ananthasayanam to make a recording. And that very rare recording is available in their archives. But by that time, Bharat Ratna MS Subbulakshmi was the most popular classical musician in India, and they decided that the most popular musician should address this. So they approached her, and TTD deputed P.V. Ananthasayanam to train her. So he visited her in Kalki Gardens, and there were many training sessions. And she learned the Suprabhatam from him, the recitational nuances, etc. AIR started the first radio broadcast in 1958 in December in Vaikuntha Ekadasi. And they never looked back, and it became a very popular broadcast. By the early 60s, it was even being broadcast in Bombay, in Maharashtra, because there is an acquaintance of mine who's growing up in Pune in those days, and he recalls hearing the Suprabhatam in the early 60s. By 1962, 61, 62, HMV had decided that, look, they might as well get a recording out. So they requested MS Subbulakshmi to do a recording as a music record. Now she took this very seriously. So she practiced for 9 months for this. And we know all this because her daughter, Mrs. Radha Vishwanathan, practiced with her. And it is from what Mrs. Vishwanathan told her son that we know how they went about it. And they went about it with a huge amount of vigor. The daily 3 to 4 hours practice, and it would have continued non-stop if Miss Vishwanathan hadn't put a stop to it, saying, look, I'm going to deliver my child and I need to do this before that. So they then went in for the recording. HMV flew down the chief recording engineer that they had from Calcutta, a gentleman called Mr. Sen, who even now after close to 70 odd years post this is recalled with great fondness by his colleagues. He was supposed to be one of the foremost engineers in India of his time on sound. He came down for the recording. They got it right in the first take. The perfect first recording. Apparently that never happened. And even that would have sufficed, but just to be on the safe side, MS Amma and Mrs. Vishwanathan did a second take. And it came out perfect. There were absolutely no problems with the recording. The recording was released in 1963 by President Radhakrishnan. There is these radio sammelans which happened annually. And the country was just coming out of the trauma of an earlier Chinese aggression. So he used that opportunity to talk about why recordings such as the Venkatesa Suprabhatam was so important. Basically underlined the routines of everyday life and how the music of this nature had the power to elevate. And while he must have been talking of very lofty ideals, I think people just loved it. I mean, the recitation just struck an immediate chord and it became a major bestseller. And it became extremely popular to the extent that by the late 60s, I think people started expressing the Venkatesa Suprabhatam in different forms. So somebody in Rajahmundry painted a set of panels for each of the verses of the Suprabhatam. By the time the 70s and the 80s came on, anybody who bought a new cassette recorder was given the Venkatesa Suprabhatam to inaugurate the device. So it became that much a part of the local culture. And by the 90s, it just established itself firmly as something which was all pervasive. I myself have heard this playing of all places in a dhaba in Loon Karansar. Those of you who know, Loon Karansar is a dhaba halfway between Bikaner and Ganganagar. So, I mean, I was working in that part of India in 1992 and 93. I got out of a car early in the morning in the middle of the desert at some 6 o'clock, and there was a TN registration truck which immediately started Suprabhatam, and it was quite a otherworldly experience. So while this is anecdotal, I'm sure it would have been heard across the length and breadth of the country. And it continues to be heard today. Even, I mean, you hear it in all kinds of places, very serendipitously. It's quite ubiquitous. So yes, I mean, that's where it is. And I believe it continues to find the new listeners, and the old listeners find new things to appreciate.
Now, today, like you said, the Venkatesa Suprabhatam is, of course, ubiquitous. You can hear it across India, even abroad, and so on. But a lot of this credit goes to the original reciters, the Talapaka family, whom you briefly mentioned earlier. Now, when the Tirumala temple was in its heyday, of course, I'm sure it was easy to sustain this morning recitation. There were pilgrims, and it was an important place that hosted kings and other important officials of the administration and so on. But at some point of time, what we know from your book is that the Tirumala temple went into a kind of a decline for various reasons. But the Talapaka family continued its recitation of the prayer even in the midst of these trying circumstances. So a lot of what we have been handed over owes itself to the dedication with which these people continued the tradition. Can you tell us a little bit about this Talapaka family and perhaps try and visualize those trying times when going to the temple, reciting at the temple was not quite as easy as it was in its heyday?
Talapaka family are all descendants of Annamacharya. So it was a family of poet saints. They were all saints, and many of them were poets. Talapaka Annamacharya's son, Pedda Tirumalacharya himself was a very prolific composer. His son, which is Annamacharya's grandson, was equally so. And we know a lot about Annamacharya because of a biography that his grandson wrote. So they were also given the recitational rights. I mean, Pedda Tirumalacharya was given a recitational rights to all the prayers, which was sung in front of Lord Venkateswara's shrine every day. Again, while direct evidences are negligible, very few, we do have some important markers. We know around about the date that they started. As I mentioned, there is a East India Company record, circa 1819, which talks about the Talapaka Walas, as the English put it, continuing the recitation. I mean, this is an exceptional service. There is no glory to them in this because this was composed by Anna. And Anna's family itself is an extremely venerated group of saints. So the Talapaka family kept this going. And in the initial period, as you mentioned, they were all reasonably well-to-do. They had a lot of grants. The kings looked after them. As I mentioned, the Vijayanagar kings were great patrons. But this did not continue. So because as the Vijayanagar empire went into decline, even though the kings were themselves great devotees of Venkateswara, they could not do much in terms of supporting the temple. And after they lost their political power, the entire situation was extremely disturbed. The Tirumala temple itself stayed by and large inviolate because there were many who still looked after it, even in the political dispensation. But the functionaries within the temple, for example, like the Talapaka family, who had to perform the daily services, would have had a terrible time. And there are English records which talk about how the jungle had overrun the environs of the temple and there were huge amount of wildlife. So there are enough records which are available. So it would have been extremely difficult at that time because most of these people have probably been living in Tirupati, which is down in the foothills, and walked up every day early in the mornings to be there in time to open the temple. The entire group, including the Talapakas and all the other functionaries. Some of them would have been resident there, but some of them would have had to come from elsewhere. So there was extreme devotion to duty. You see, because when the going is good, everybody does a great job. But all these people kept doing their duty and kept doing what they were supposed to do, even when the going was bad. And that is the kind of stuff that inspires us in history, you see, because it's very easy to be devout and very easy to be so-called believer when the environment is favorable. But as history shows us, there will be good times and there will be bad times. And those who are truly dutiful and devout will do their bit regardless of the circumstances. So I think the Talapaka family is owed that debt of gratitude. Because you see, these kind of cultural traditions are a bit like a relay race. You have to keep passing them on until those who are sustaining it stay true to their task. It will get passed on. They find other things to do. It won't get passed on, which is fine. There's nothing good or bad. See, every tradition will depend on the context of whether the adherents want to take it forward or not. Okay, so there's no right or wrong. But in this instance of the Venkatesha Suprabhatam, at least over the last 500, 600 years, those who were given the responsibility of carrying it forward have done a very good job. And I think we should be grateful to them.
For researchers interested in doing a little more work on these sort of matters, what further research directions would you recommend? What are the things that remain to be studied? What are some of the things that you think should be studied a little more deeply, a little more further?
So look, first of all, mine is not a scholarly foray at all. So it's basically an amateurish first attempt. So there's lots to do. At the moment, there is a book called New Catalogus Catalogorum, which captures all the extant manuscript copies for most of the Sanskrit manuscripts. And the Catalogus Catalogorum is listed around 40 manuscript versions of the Venkatesa Suprabhatam. Tirumala TTD has already done a standard version, so I don't think that is required. But what is required is for someone to look at all these manuscripts. And I'm sure there are more than 40, because by the time the Catalogus Catalogorum came out, also it would have been slightly out of date. So if somebody could collect all the manuscript versions and look at the colophons, which is basically the small notations which the scribes make at the bottom of the manuscripts, they would get a lot more insights into the history of this poem. So that's one area which definitely somebody should consider who's so inclined. For this and for various other areas, but for this could be one area. The second area is the Maratha records, because the Marathas did control this area for a while, and they were very diligent in writing their reports. In fact, I'm myself chasing up for a report on the functionaries and ceremonies in Tirumala circa 1750, which is listed in Madras Oriental Manuscript Library. So the Maratha records are going to be very rich area for future research. Golconda Sultanate generally. Their records could definitely throw up maybe some mentions. I don't know. East India Company records again could throw up some more information on the recitation of this prayer. I think there is still a lot to do. If someone wishes to dive in deep, there is a lot of areas of future research which is possible. A commentary in English I've dealt with one of the four prayers, because the Venkatesha Suprabhatam is one of four prayers. There are three other prayers which perhaps somebody can take up. So this is just the start. There is lots of further research possibilities. Whoever wishes to undertake such forays, there is lots to do.
So this can be a lifelong sustained engagement if one actually wishes to pursue it.
Any foray can absorb researchers for long periods of time, because if you wish to get into detail in our country, in every aspect, something as mundane as weights and measures of the pre-colonial era can take around 10 to 15 years for somebody to study it. I wouldn't be surprised if, and the Tirumala temple has been an extraordinary institution since times immemorial. And just the inscriptional evidences of the temple start from around 800, 900 CE. So, well, I mean, as I mentioned, you can engage with it as deeply as you like, and I mean, at whichever level you like. So, but yes, so answer your question, yes, some people can devote lots of time to this.
Right, Venkatesh, thank you so much. It was fascinating to listen to you on the Venkatesa Suprabhatam, its history, the circumstances of its composition, the reasons for its popularity in the last 50, 70 years. I hope listeners enjoy listening to this as much as I did. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Karthik.
Thank you for listening in till the end. Please share this episode with a friend on social media, WhatsApp, or anywhere else. It would mean the world to us. And in case you're listening via iTunes or Apple Podcasts, please leave us a rating and a review. Subscribe to BIC Talks on email or your favorite podcast app and don't miss out on future episodes. This episode of BIC Talks has Gaurav Krishna as our sound engineer with support from S. Sarvanaraj and Lekha Naidu. And the accompanying episode artwork was made by Chandni Venkataraman.
Thank you for listening to this episode of BIC Talks. This podcast can be accessed on our website, bangaloreinternationalcentre.org, as well as on any of your favorite podcast platforms. Tune in for new episodes every week, and do subscribe to our YouTube channel and follow our Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram pages to stay informed on our latest updates.